The hands tell the story before the man ever opens his mouth. Dale Mercer's hands were 53 years of honest work compressed into skin and scar tissue. The knuckles were mapped with old cuts that had healed wrong, raised ridges of pale tissue from decades of sharp metal and stripped bolts. His right pinky finger bent slightly outward where a transmission housing had caught it back in 1998. The kind of injury a man works through because missing a shift means missing rent. The calluses on his palms had grown so thick over the years that he'd stopped feeling the texture of things the way other people did. He felt pressure and temperature and the subtle vibration of an engine that wasn't running quite right. But softness was mostly gone. Softness had been going for a long time. He stood in the kitchen of his one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Bloomington, Indiana, on a Tuesday night in late September, and he looked at the notebook on the counter the way a man looks at a document that tells him something he already knows but hoped was wrong. $517. That was the number written at the top of the page in his own handwriting. Below it, a column of figures: rent due in 10 days, gas for the truck, groceries for 2 weeks, the prescription he'd been putting off for his back. The math always came out the same. It came out worse than the number at the top. The apartment was one bedroom, technically, though the second room was barely larger than a generous closet. He'd put a twin bed in there from the Goodwill on Walnut Street, a dresser he'd found on the curb outside a college house in August, and a lamp with a shade that didn't quite fit the base. His son Caleb had been sleeping in that room for 8 months, 16 years old, 6 feet already, folding himself into that small space every night the way a person folds something that doesn't want to fold. The rest of the apartment was what it was. A couch that had come from a curb 2 blocks over, a kitchen table with 3 chairs, 2 of which matched, a mattress on the floor in the main bedroom because the frame had gone in the move and Dale hadn't replaced it yet and somehow hadn't gotten around to it, and now 8 months had passed. The walls were thin enough that Dale could hear Mrs. Garrett's television through the drywall every night. Game shows mostly, the kind with lots of applause and a host who laughed too easily. The smell of the laundromat below was constant, hot lint and detergent and something vaguely chemical. Dale had stopped noticing it after the first month. That was how the mind protected itself, he supposed. You stopped noticing the things you couldn't change. He could hear Caleb in the small room. Not music exactly, the faint rhythm of something coming through headphones, a pulse more than a sound. The light under the door was the pale blue of a phone screen. The door itself was closed, as it almost always was these days, and Dale had learned not to knock unless there was a specific reason. The boy would come out when he was ready. Pushing never helped. Pushing just made them both feel worse in different ways. Dale had won custody. That was the official version of the last 2 years. Judge Whitfield had signed the order 8 months ago after a process that had cost Dale $43,000 he hadn't had, that he'd scraped together through a second mortgage on a truck he now owned free and clear only because he'd sold it and bought something cheaper. Through 2 rounds of selling tools and buying cheaper tools, through borrowing from Doyle Briggs at work in amounts small enough that neither of them had to feel uncomfortable about it. He had won custody. His son lived with him. Caleb slept 10 feet away behind a closed door and had said fewer than 100 words to him this week. Winning was a complicated thing. He'd met Renee Wolcott at a 4th of July party in 2004 when he was 33 and she was 29, and the summer had that particular quality summers have when you're still young enough to believe things will keep getting better. They'd married in 2006. Caleb was born in 2008. For a while, the arithmetic of their life together had added up to something that felt like enough. A house they were buying slowly, a boy who laughed easily, Sunday mornings that had a shape and a smell and a routine. Then it stopped adding up, the way things do when 2 people want different futures and can't find the language to say so clearly until it's too late to say it kindly. The divorce had been relatively clean. It was the custody fight that came after that had bled him dry. The phone buzzed against the counter. Dale looked at the name on the screen and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not quite pain, not quite fear, something that lived in the space between those 2 things and had no better name than what it was. Renee. He considered letting it go to voicemail. He always considered letting it go to voicemail. He answered because letting it go to voicemail with Renee meant something worse was coming down the road. And Dale had learned that the hard way too. Dale, her voice was the one she used for practical matters, crisp, reasonable, the voice of someone who had already decided how the conversation was going to go. I need to talk about Caleb's winter things. He needs a proper coat, new boots. The stuff he came with doesn't fit anymore. Dale leaned against the counter and looked at the notebook. I bought him a coat in August. He's grown since August. That's what teenagers do. A brief pause, the kind that wasn't really a pause, but a reset, a gathering. I'm not calling to argue, Dale. I'm trying to help. If you can send me $500, I can take care of everything he needs before the weather turns. $500. He looked at the number at the top of the page. That's not how this works, Renee. The custody order is clear. I provide for him when he's here. You provide when he's with you. He's with you most of the time now. Her voice shifted. Not harder exactly, but more careful. The way a person sounds when they're choosing words that will be useful later. Dale, I'm not trying to make this difficult. I'm genuinely concerned. You're living in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. Caleb is sleeping in a room the size of a closet. We're fine. Are you? The question hung there, because Glenn mentioned, don't. Dale's voice came out harder than he intended. Don't bring Glenn into this conversation. Glenn Wolcott, Renee's older brother. The man who wore suits that probably cost more than Dale made in a good month, who drove a car that had never known a parking lot, who had been present at every custody hearing with a yellow legal pad and an expression of measured concern that Dale had wanted to put his fist through approximately 40 times. Glenn had spent 2 years quietly suggesting to Renee that Dale was unstable, directionless, the wrong kind of father for a growing boy. Glenn had been helpful and supportive in ways that cost Dale everything he'd saved. He's family, Dale. He cares about Caleb. He cares about something. Dale kept his voice level. It's not the same thing. Renee sighed. The long-suffering sound she'd perfected over years of marriage, the one that used to make Dale apologize reflexively, that used to make him feel like the unreasonable one. He'd gotten better at recognizing it for what it was. Send me the $500, she said. Prove you can actually take care of him, or I'm going to have to reconsider whether this arrangement is really working. She hung up. Dale stood in the kitchen for a while, holding the dead phone, listening to the hum of the dryers below. Through Caleb's door, the faint pulse of headphone music continued unchanged. His son didn't know that conversation had just happened. His son was 10 feet away and didn't know a lot of things. Dale opened his laptop. The machine took 3 minutes to boot, an old complaint he'd stopped registering. He started the way he always started when the walls got too close, looking at things he couldn't afford. The way a man at sea looks at a distant shore and lets himself imagine, briefly, what solid ground would feel like. He'd been browsing foreclosure listings for a couple of months. Not seriously, or so he'd told himself, just looking. The way a person might look at something impossible and let themselves imagine it briefly before coming back to reality. Most of what he found was either in terrible shape or in places so remote they might as well be on the moon. Houses that banks had given up on. Properties that had exceeded anyone's willingness to put money into them. He told himself he was just looking. The listing loaded slowly. A property in Brown County, 1,847 Ridgewood Lane, Millhaven, Indiana. Minimum bid, $500. Dale stared at the number for a long moment, certain he was misreading it. He clicked through. The photographs came up one by one, grainy, and probably taken on someone's phone in low light. A 2-story structure, craftsman style, he thought, probably built sometime in the 20s, with white paint peeling away to expose gray wood underneath, like something shedding a skin it had outgrown. Every window he could see was either broken or missing entirely. The front porch sagged in the middle, its support posts rotted through at the base. Thick ropes of ivy had consumed most of the right side of the building, working their way under the siding and almost certainly into the walls themselves. Behind the house, a barn leaned heavily to one side. 3 acres. Brown County. Brown County meant hills and trees and the kind of quiet that a person had to drive 40 minutes to find from Bloomington. The description was 2 sentences. Foreclosed property sold as is. Structure requires significant repair. Dale zoomed in on the photographs. He did what he always did with machines. He looked past the surface to the structure underneath. He looked at what could be fixed versus what was simply gone. The roof was bad, the porch was gone, practically speaking. The windows were all work, but the foundation stones looked solid. The walls were plumb. He could see that even in the grainy photos. The chimney that rose through the center of the house showed no obvious lean, no displacement of the mortar lines. It had bones. He looked at the notebook. $517, rent due in 10 days. He thought about Caleb in the room the size of a closet. He thought about 3 acres in actual silence in a real bedroom with walls thick enough that a person couldn't hear the neighbor's television through the drywall. He thought about Renee's voice saying Glenn mentioned, and something cold settled at the base of his spine and didn't go away. At 1 in the morning, Dale filled out the bidding form. He typed in his debit card number carefully, checking each digit twice. His hands were steady. That surprised him a little. The confirmation email arrived 3 minutes later. Congratulations. You are the winning bidder for 1847 Ridgewood Lane, Millhaven, Indiana. Dale closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen and listened to the building breathe around him. The dryers below, Mrs. Garrett's television through the wall, the faint sound of the city outside, his son's closed door. He had just spent everything he had. He sat with that for a while. He didn't feel reckless. He felt, for the first time in a long time, like he'd made a decision rather than had one made for him. The drive to Brown County took 2 hours through countryside that had turned to rust and gold in the early October cold. Dale had told Caleb they were going to look at a property. He'd kept the details deliberately vague because he wasn't sure how to explain the details, and he'd wanted Caleb to see it first, to have some response to the reality of it before Dale tried to put language around what he'd done. Caleb sat in the passenger seat with his earbuds in and looked out at the rolling hills and stands of hardwood that grew thicker as they left Bloomington behind. He'd accepted the gas station coffee and the breakfast sandwich Dale had brought without comment. He'd climbed into the truck with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned that reactions cost something and was conserving. 16 years old. He had Renee's dark eyes and Dale's jaw, and a stillness about him that didn't quite belong to either of them. Something he had developed on his own. Some piece of armor he'd built during the 2 years his parents had spent fighting over him in courtrooms. Dale had watched his son become quieter as the custody case had gone on, had watched the boy's face and learned to give less away, had understood, in the way you understand something you can't do anything about, that the silence was protection, that a kid who didn't show what he felt couldn't be used as ammunition by either side. He hadn't known how to fix that. He still didn't. Millhaven, Indiana was barely a town. A main street with a diner, a hardware store, a general store that sold antiques on the weekends when the leaf lookers came through. Ridgewood Lane was 3 miles outside town proper, a 2-lane road that wound through forest past properties, marked only by rusted mailboxes and gravel driveways disappearing into trees. Dale almost missed the turn, caught it at the last moment when he spotted the number 1847 on a mailbox that hung at an angle from a post that had been leaning since probably before Dale was born. The driveway was 2 parallel tracks through tall grass, branches scraping both sides of the truck as Dale eased forward. Then the trees opened into a clearing, and there it was. Caleb pulled one earbud out. The house stood at the center of 3 acres of overgrown land, like something that had been forgotten mid-sentence. The white paint wasn't just peeling, it was mostly gone. The underlying clapboard weathered to a silver gray that caught the October light in a way that was almost beautiful if you were in the right frame of mind. The front porch sagged so dramatically in the middle that it formed a shallow V, the support post at the end still standing while the center had given up. Every visible window was either broken or absent, the openings dark against the gray wood, giving the house the look of something that had stopped watching a long time ago. The ivy on the right wall had grown so thick it looked structural. The barn in the back had surrendered its roof to gravity and weather and was in the process of returning itself to the earth. Caleb stared through the windshield for a long moment. "What is this?" "It's ours," Dale said. "I bought it." Caleb turned to look at him. The expression on his face cycled through things too fast to name before settling into something flat and careful. "You bought this. $500, 3 acres, the house, the barn. It's a foreclosure." Caleb looked back at the house. "Dad." His voice was quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. "This isn't a house. This is a place where a house used to be. It needs work. It needs to not exist. Caleb opened the truck door and stepped out. Dale followed. They walked toward the structure in the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against the sides of things. Up close, the damage was thorough. The porch steps were soft and crumbling, half gone. The front door swung open at a touch. The lock rusted to nothing. Inside, the smell hit them first. Mold and decay, and the thick, closed smell of air that hadn't moved in years. Dale's phone flashlight cut through the dark. The interior was worse than the exterior in the way that interiors always are. The outside weathers, but the inside drowns. Water damage had bloomed across the walls and ceiling in brown stains the size of bedsheets. The hardwood floors were warped and buckled, several boards missing entirely to show the crawl space below. Plaster had fallen from the ceiling in chunks that had landed and stayed, collecting 20 years of dust, showing the lath and ancient wiring behind. But the bones were there. Dale could see it the way he could see a seized engine that was worth rebuilding. The structure was compromised on the surface and solid underneath. The main beam running the length of the house was intact. The brick chimney didn't move when he pressed against it. The staircase creaked under his weight, but held without flexing. Caleb moved through the rooms behind him, saying nothing. They went upstairs, 3 bedrooms. One still had wallpaper, a floral pattern, probably cheerful once, now hanging in strips. One had a child's drawing pinned to the wall with a thumbtack that had rusted solid, a stick figure house with a smiling sun, dated in careful young handwriting, June 1994. Caleb stopped at the drawing, reached up, almost touched it, pulled his hands back. Someone lived here until about 30 years ago. Looks like it. Then they left everything. Dale looked around the room, at the wallpaper, the drawing, the window with a broken pane that framed a rectangle of blue October sky. People leave for all kinds of reasons. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he turned, and his voice was measured and careful, and had something underneath it that Dale recognized as the thing his son kept most carefully controlled. You fought for 2 years to get me. You spent everything you had, and now we're here. He gestured at the room around them. Did you ever once ask me what I wanted? Or did you just decide? Dale held his son's gaze. I decided. I'm still deciding. That's not an answer. No, Dale said. It's not. They stood in the upstairs room while the October wind moved through the broken window and made the wallpaper strips flutter like something trying to get free. They moved in on a Tuesday in late October, which was also the day Renee found out about the address change because the school updated their emergency contact records, and she called within 2 hours of receiving the notification. Dale let that call go to voicemail. Then he let the next 3 go to voicemail. Then he answered because there was no version of the future where not answering made anything easier. Renee was precise and cold in the way she got when she was building towards something. She knew about the house. She knew about the $500. She knew, and this part came at the end, dropped in carefully the way a sharp thing is set down on a hard surface, that Glenn had done some research on the property, that there was a history, that a family had lived there once and had their child removed by Child Protective Services, that the circumstances had been troubling, that Glenn was prepared to help her put together a motion for emergency custody modification. Dale ended the call and stood in what would become the kitchen, surrounded by tools and camping gear, and 2 sleeping bags rolled out on the warped floor, and he felt the walls of the situation contracting around him the way they always seemed to, the way they had for 2 years now. He put his phone face down on the counter and went back to work. They covered 6 windows that first day, plywood cut to fit the openings, screwed in against the cold. The house got darker but warmer, more contained. By evening, Dale had a fire going in the brick fireplace from wood stacked in the barn, and they ate canned soup from a propane stove set up on the kitchen floor, and the house made sounds around them, settling creaks, wind through gaps, something moving in the attic. And Caleb sat with his back against the wall and said nothing for a while, and then said, "She's going to try to take me back." Dale stirred his soup. "She's going to try, though. Glenn's helping her." "Glenn's always helping." Caleb looked at the fire. The light moved across his face and made him look younger than 16, or maybe just made him look like what he actually was, a kid who had been carrying too much for too long. Why does he care so much? He barely knows me. Dale kept his eyes on the fire. That question sat in the room with them, and Dale didn't have an answer for it. Not yet. But something about the way Caleb said it, "He barely knows me," settled at the bottom of Dale's chest like a stone dropped in still water. Something that would stay there. "If he ever makes you uncomfortable," Dale said carefully, "you tell me, right away. Don't worry about being polite." Caleb looked at his father. Something shifted in his expression. A question he didn't ask. A recognition of something in Dale's voice that warranted attention. "Okay," he said. "Yeah." They ate in silence after that. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the trees. The fire crackled, and the house groaned in the wind, and the plywood-covered windows held the cold out, and the light in, and it was not comfortable, not warm enough, not what either of them needed. And it was theirs in a way the apartment above the laundromat had never been and never would be. Doyle Briggs came out on a Saturday morning with his truck and his toolbox and a six-pack of something dark, and the two of them worked on the porch while Caleb was at school. Doyle was the kind of man who said a lot with very little. He asked questions when questions were needed and offered silence when silence was better. And after 17 years working the bay next to Dale's at Harmon's Auto, he could read the difference. They worked for a while without talking, pulling the rotted porch boards, checking the substructure, deciding what to save and what to replace. The October air was cold and smelled like leaves and wood smoke from somewhere back in the trees. "People in Millhaven don't talk much about this place," Doyle said finally. He was measuring a board, pencil behind his ear, not looking up. "Stopped in at the general store on my way here, mentioned where I was headed." Dale was pulling a rusted nail from a joist. "And?" Man behind the counter got quiet. Doyle marked his measurement. Not unfriendly quiet, more like careful quiet, like he was deciding what to say. He looked up, said something about a family, said it was a bad situation. Then he moved on. Dale set the nail in the coffee can he was using for hardware. "What kind of bad situation?" "Didn't say." Doyle picked up his saw. "But he said the father was a good man." Dale thought about the drawing upstairs. The stick figure house with the smiling sun. June 1994. Someone's good father had stood in these rooms at some point, stood with that, had tried. He went back to pulling nails. The thought stayed with him the way thoughts do when they're not quite finished with you. It was 3 days later, on a Friday evening, that he found the Polaroid. Dale was clearing debris from the kitchen, old newspapers, mouse-chewed insulation that had fallen through a gap, the accumulated sediment of 20 years of nothing. He was working around a cabinet that hung crooked on the wall, one hinge gone, the other barely holding. When he set his pry bar to it and levered gently, the whole cabinet shifted, and something fluttered down from behind it and landed on the floor at his feet. A photograph. Polaroid format, bent slightly at one corner, the image faded but intact. 3 people standing in front of this house. The house as it had looked, 30 years ago? The paint was white and fresh, the porch straight and solid, flower boxes under the windows. A man in his mid-30s with work clothes and a broad, tired, genuinely happy smile. A woman beside him with brown hair and gentle eyes leaning slightly into his arm. Between them, a little girl, 7, maybe 8, grinning at the camera with the specific joy of a child who has lost her 2 front teeth and knows it and is showing everyone. Someone had written in fading blue ink along the white border at the bottom, "Frank, Diane, Sophie, summer 1994. Dale turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same handwriting, smaller. "First summer in the dream house. Frank finally finished the porch. Sophie loves her room. So much work ahead, but we're happy." He stood in the ruined kitchen and looked at the photograph for a long time. Frank and Diane and Sophie, happy in the summer of 1994, in a house that had been empty for more than 20 years. What happened? He set the photograph on the counter, propped against the wall, and went back to work. But he kept looking at it, the man's smile, the woman's tired eyes, the little girl who loved her room in the dream house that nobody had lived in since before Caleb was born. It was Caleb who found the letter. 2 evenings later, Dale came home from a shift at Harmon's to find his son in the upstairs hallway, crouched at the base of the wall, examining the baseboard with unusual intensity. Caleb had developed, over the weeks in the house, a habit of paying close attention to things, to the way the house was built, to where things were placed, to the materials and methods of it. It was the same instinct Dale had brought to engines for 30 years, transplanted in his son and directed at wood and plaster. "This piece is newer than the rest," Caleb said without looking up. "Different paint, less worn." Dale crouched beside him, ran his thumb along the baseboard. Caleb was right. The profile was slightly different. The surface in better condition. The paint a shade that didn't quite match the aging around it. Dale took out his utility knife, scored the paint seal where baseboard met wall, worked the edge of the knife under and pried gently. The baseboard came away cleanly. Behind it, where it had been flush against the wall, someone had cut a neat rectangular opening in the drywall. Not large, 4 inches by 8, roughly, and clearly intentional. The edges were clean, the cut deliberate. Inside the opening, a single envelope, pressed flat against the cavity. Dale reached in and took it out. The paper was yellowed, unsealed, addressed to no one. He unfolded the pages inside. 3 sheets of lined notebook paper, covered front and back in handwriting that was careful and slightly rushed at the same time, the way handwriting looks when a person is writing quickly and trying to be precise about it. Caleb came to stand beside him. June 1997, the letter began. "Dear Carol, I'm writing this because I need to say it somewhere, and Frank doesn't want anyone to know. He thinks we can handle it ourselves if we stay quiet. But I'm scared." Dale read it once through in silence. Then he handed it to Caleb. His son read it standing in the hallway of the house, in the fading afternoon light coming through the newly plywood-covered windows. And when he finished, he looked up at his father with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but lived somewhere close to both. "There's a secret room," Caleb said slowly, "in this house." Dale looked at the wall. He reached out and knocked. Solid. Moved 2 feet to the right, knocked again, then further. At a certain point, the sound changed. Deeper, hollow, empty. He turned to face his son. "Behind this wall," Dale said quietly. They stood in the hallway of the dream house, and the October wind moved through the gaps in the old walls, and something that had been waiting in the dark for 25 years waited a little longer. The hollow sound stayed with Dale long after they'd stopped knocking. He lay in his sleeping bag that night on the living room floor and stared at the ceiling and thought about what a hollow wall meant in a house where a father had been trying to protect his daughter from something nobody else could see. He thought about Frank Aldrin standing in the same hallway, measuring and planning and working alone at night after his wife was asleep, building something that the people who loved him most would eventually use against him. Dale understood that kind of loneliness in a way that settled into his chest like cold weather settling into an old joint. The loneliness of being certain about something that nobody around you would confirm. The loneliness of acting anyway. He didn't sleep much. In the morning, he got up before Caleb and made coffee on the propane stove and stood at the kitchen counter looking at the Polaroid he'd propped against the wall 3 days ago. Frank and Diane and Sophie in the summer of 1994, standing in front of the dream house with its fresh white paint and its straight porch and its flower boxes. Frank's broad, tired, genuinely happy smile. Diane leaning into his arm. Sophie with her missing front teeth, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. So much work ahead, but we're happy. He picked up the photograph and turned it over and read the back again. Then he put it in his shirt pocket where it stayed for the rest of the day. They found the room on a Saturday morning, working together with the focused quiet that had become their shared language in this house. Dale had spent the previous evening with a tape measure and a notepad, doing the kind of arithmetic that doesn't lie. He'd measured the exterior of the second floor, 42 feet front to back. Then he'd gone room by room, measuring each interior space, the hallway, the thickness of the walls, accounting for everything he could account for. When he added it all up, he got 37 feet, maybe 38 on a generous measurement, 4 feet missing, maybe 5. He'd drawn it out on the notepad, the rooms, the hallway, the exterior walls. The gaps sat at the back of the second floor, behind what had once been a bedroom. The room with the floral wallpaper, the room where Sophie's crayon drawing of the stick figure house was still pinned to the wall with a rusted thumbtack. Caleb had looked at the drawing for a long time the night before. He hadn't said anything about it. But in the morning when Dale came upstairs with the tape measure and the notepad, Caleb was already in the hallway, running his hands along the wall, pressing his palm flat against the plaster and moving it slowly, feeling for something. They worked the problem from two directions. Dale measured again, more carefully this time, checking his numbers. Caleb examined surfaces, the wallpaper in the back bedroom, the baseboard along the floor, the places where one material met another, and you could sometimes see, if you knew what to look for, the evidence of work done after the original construction. It was Caleb who found it. He was in the back bedroom, moving slowly along the interior wall, the wall that should have backed up against empty air according to the measurements, but didn't, when he stopped and crouched down near the baseboard. The wallpaper here was the same floral pattern as the rest of the room, pale pink flowers on a cream background, hanging in strips where the paste had failed. But in one section, about 2.5 feet wide and positioned roughly in the center of the wall, the pattern didn't quite align. The flowers were off by 1/2 inch, close enough to miss if you weren't paying attention, different enough to register as wrong once you'd seen it. Caleb pressed against the section. The wallpaper gave slightly, not the way plaster gives, but the way a door gives, with a sense of something behind it that could move. He looked back at Dale. Dale crossed the room and pressed his palm flat against the same section. He pushed with steady, even pressure, and felt beneath his hand the distinct sensation of something that wanted to swing. He worked his fingers along the edge of the section. Near the floor, behind a piece of trim that looked original but wasn't quite flush with the wall on either side, his fingers found a small wooden peg seated in a hole. Not a nail, a peg, the kind you set deliberately, the kind you can pull. He pulled it. Something clicked. The section of wall, 2 feet wide, 6 feet tall, covered in wallpaper to match the surrounding surface, swung inward an inch on hinges that had been mortised into the frame so cleanly they were invisible from the outside. Dale pulled the edge. The door opened smoothly, silently, the way something opens when it's been built with patience and care, and the specific intention that it should work perfectly every time. The smell that came out was the smell of a sealed room, stale and still and slightly sweet in a way that wasn't quite decay, more like preservation. The smell of air that had been sitting undisturbed for a very long time. Dale turned on his phone flashlight. Caleb turned on his. They stood at the threshold and looked in. The room was small, 10 feet by 12, maybe slightly less. No windows. The walls were painted a soft yellow that would have been warm and cheerful once, and near the ceiling, running all the way around the room, someone had stenciled white clouds. Small, careful clouds, painted by hand with obvious effort and obvious love, as if someone had been determined to bring sky into a windowless space. A twin bed sat against the far wall, made up with a purple comforter decorated with stars, the fabric faded but intact. Beside it, a small wooden nightstand with a lamp shaped like a crescent moon. Against one wall, bookshelves filled with children's books, titles Dale recognized, titles his own mother had read to him, titles that placed a childhood precisely in time. A wooden toy chest beneath the shelves, lid closed, but it was the walls that held him. Every surface not occupied by furniture was covered in drawings. Children's drawings, each one taped carefully in place. The tape yellowed and brittle now, but still holding. Dozens of them, maybe 100, covering every inch of available wall space in a way that felt less like decoration and more like a record, like someone documenting something that needed to be documented. Caleb stepped in first. Dale followed. They moved through the space slowly, carefully, as if the wrong step might disturb something that had settled into its final arrangement and shouldn't be disturbed. The air was heavy with the weight of a place that had meant everything to someone and had then been sealed away and forgotten. Dale started at the drawings nearest the door and followed them around the room. The ones on the left wall were dated 1995 in a child's careful handwriting. Houses with smoking chimneys, smiling stick figure families, flowers and gardens under skies full of round yellow suns. The drawings of a child who felt safe, who saw the world as a place that contained warmth and color, and people who smiled. He followed the progression. By 1996, the colors had changed. The yellows and reds gave way to blues and grays. The smiling families disappeared and lone figures appeared instead, standing apart from each other in spaces that had grown larger and less defined. The houses developed bars on the windows, The flowers wilted on their stems. By 1997, the figure that appeared most often was small and solitary, and the spaces around it were dark at the edges in a way that suggested something pressing in from outside the frame. Dale moved to the back wall. The drawings here were from 1998, the latest ones in the room. He scanned them slowly, reading them the way you read something that matters, taking time with each one. At the end of the sequence in the far corner was a single drawing dated November 1998. The paper was slightly larger than the others. Sophie had pressed harder with her crayon. The lines were deep, the colors dense. It showed a hand, a large adult hand with long fingers, reaching out of solid darkness toward the right edge of the paper. The fingers were slightly too long. The proportions were not quite right in a way that felt deliberate rather than childish, as if the wrongness was the point, as if the hand being wrong was exactly what needed to be communicated. There was no house, no figure, no sun, just the hand and the darkness it came from, and the white space at the right edge of the page that the fingers were reaching toward. No caption, no date beyond the month and year, just the image. Dale looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at Caleb. His son was standing in the center of the room, very still, his phone flashlight pointed at the drawing. His face had the careful, closed expression he wore when something had moved him and he didn't want it visible. But his jaw was set in a way Dale recognized, the way his own jaw set when he was working something through, when a problem had revealed a shape he hadn't expected. Neither of them said anything for a while. The small room held the silence the way a sealed space holds air, completely, with no place for it to go. Sophie's journal was in the nightstand drawer, a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover. Her name written on the inside front cover in red crayon, Sophie Aldrin, private, do not read. The letters uneven, some of them backwards. The handwriting of a child who was still making peace with the alphabet. Dale sat on the edge of the bed and held the journal and thought about the line between necessary and wrong. Caleb was standing by the bookshelves, looking at the titles without pulling any of them out. He glanced over at his father and at the journal in his father's hands, and he didn't say anything, and somehow the silence was permission. Dale opened it. The early entries were ordinary in the way all children's diaries are ordinary. School, a friend named Maya, complaints about homework, a description of a birthday party. The handwriting grew steadier as the pages progressed, the entries longer, the observations more precise. Sophie had been a careful child, a noticing child, the kind who paid attention to the texture of things. The entries from 1996 were where it changed. March 4th, 1996. The handwriting was slightly cramped, pressed harder into the paper than usual. Uncle Glenn came over today. I went to my room. He stayed for dinner. Daddy came and sat with me after. He didn't make me come down. August 12th, 1996. Uncle Glenn and Aunt Carol came. I hid in my closet. Daddy found me. He didn't tell me I was being silly. He just sat on the floor outside the closet and talked to me through the door until they left. Dale kept reading. The entries about Glenn Wolcott appeared every few months, always with the same pattern. Glenn came, Sophie hid, Frank protected her without asking her to explain herself. The entries had a consistent quality that was different from a child's general fears. This was not the anxiety of a child who was afraid of the dark or afraid of strangers. This was something with a specific face, in a specific voice, and specific memories attached to it. October 12th, 1997. Daddy showed me my safe room today. It's so pretty with the yellow walls and the clouds he painted. He said I can come here whenever I need to feel safe. I asked safe from what? He just hugged me and said from anything that scares you. I think he knows. April 22nd, 1998. Uncle Glenn visited. I was in my safe room the whole time. Daddy brought me lunch on a tray. He sat with me for a while. Through the wall, I could hear Uncle Glenn asking where I was. Daddy told him I was at a friend's house. Uncle Glenn said, "That's too bad. I haven't seen my favorite niece in a long time." His voice sounds like something wrong. Dale stopped on that phrase and read it again. His voice sounds like something wrong, an 11-year-old reaching for language to describe something that didn't have clean language, finding the most honest words available. He turned pages. The entries grew sparser through 1998, as if Sophie had been saving her energy, as if the act of writing had become more effortful. The last entry was dated December 3rd, 1999. They found me. I was in my safe room like always when Uncle Glenn visits. He brought a lady with him. She had papers. Daddy tried to stop her, but she had papers. She found the door. She made me come out. Uncle Glenn was standing in the hallway. He was smiling at me. The lady asked me lots of questions. She asked if I was scared of being in the room. I said no. I put myself in there. She didn't believe me. She says hiding children is not safe. But I wasn't hiding. I was being safe. Those are different things. They took me with them. I didn't get to bring. The entry ended there, mid-sentence. The pen had trailed off to the right, a long, unintentional line, as if Sophie's hand had been interrupted in the middle of a word and the pen had kept moving without her. There were no more entries after that date. Dale closed the journal and set it on the nightstand exactly where it had been. He looked at the clouds Frank had painted near the ceiling, small and careful and white, made with obvious effort, made with love, made for a child who needed sky in a windowless space. Caleb was reading over his shoulder by the end. Dale had felt him there but hadn't said anything. When he closed the journal, Caleb straightened up and walked to the yellow wall where a window should have been and stood with his back to his father. She wasn't hiding, Caleb said quietly. She was being safe. Yes, there's a difference. Yes, a long silence. Outside, through the walls of the house, the November wind moved through the trees. Glenn, Caleb said, the name by itself sitting in the air of the room. Don't say anything yet, Dale said. There's more. He found Frank Aldrin's journal under the floorboards. In the corner of the hidden room near the small closet, one board sat slightly proud of the others. Not enough to trip on, not enough to notice unless you were looking for the things a man might hide in a house he was afraid of losing. Dale worked the board up with his utility knife, careful not to damage it. Below, wrapped in a plastic bag sealed with electrical tape, a leather-bound notebook. Frank J. Aldrin. Private. Dale took it downstairs, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, the table he'd salvaged from the Millhaven junkyard 3 weeks ago and refinished himself, the table that had become the center of their daily life in this house, and opened it. He read for 4 hours. Frank Aldrin had been a construction foreman from Evansville, Indiana, who had moved his family to Brown County in 1989 because Diane had grown up in small towns and wanted her children to grow up the same way. They had adopted Sophie in 1993 after 6 years of trying for a biological child, after a process that had been long and expensive and finally quietly joyful. Frank wrote about the day they brought Sophie home with the restraint of a man who didn't often put his feelings on paper and was trying to get it right. The early entries were practical: house repairs, costs, timelines, notes about Sophie's adjustment to her new home. Sophie had come from a difficult background, Frank noted. Multiple foster placements. The agency had been vague about the details, citing confidentiality, saying only that Sophie had experienced some early instability and might need time. She was adjusting. She was happy. She was starting to call them Mom and Dad. Then Glenn Wolcott entered the journal. Diane's sister Carol had married Glenn in 1991. Frank had met him at the wedding, formed no particular opinion, moved on. But when Glenn began visiting after Sophie's adoption, always with Carol initially, then occasionally without her on the pretense of being in the area, Frank began noticing things. March 3rd, 1996. Frank's handwriting was compact and deliberate. Sophie hid in her room the entire time Glenn was here tonight, wouldn't come out for dinner. When I checked on her after, she said Glenn's eyes were wrong. She couldn't explain what she meant. Diane says Sophie is just shy with new people. But this isn't shyness. Shyness is general. This is specific. August 17th, 1996. Glenn and Carol visited again. Sophie ran upstairs the moment Glenn came through the door. Later, I found her in her closet, hands over her ears, shaking. I asked her what was wrong. She whispered something that I've been thinking about ever since. She said, he knows things about me. Bad things, from before. Dale stopped. Read that again. From before. Before the Aldrins. Before Millhaven. Before Sophie had a bedroom with a crayon drawing of a stick figure house and a smiling sun. He kept reading. December 2nd, 1996. I tried to talk to Diane about Glenn. She got defensive immediately. Said he's Carol's husband. He's respected. I'm seeing problems where there aren't any. She might be right, I might be wrong. But Sophie's fear is not general anxiety. It has a shape. It has Glenn's shape. April 15th, 1997. I've decided, if no one else will take this seriously, I will. I'm going to build Sophie a place where she can go when Glenn visits. Somewhere she controls. Somewhere with a lock that only works from the inside, so it's her choice always. Diane thinks I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. But I watched my daughter shake in a closet last weekend because a man walked through our front door, and I am done not doing anything about it. The construction log that followed was detailed and careful. Materials, measurements, methods. Frank had reconfigured the back hallway to claim a 4 by 12-foot space, framed it with 2 by 6s, soundproofed the walls with batting and a second layer of drywall, installed a ventilation connection to the main system. He'd built the door from scratch, solid core, hinges mortised invisible from the outside, the whole surface covered in wallpaper to match the bedroom wall. He'd spent 2 months on the lock mechanism alone, machining it himself so that it operated smoothly and silently from the inside and couldn't be opened from the outside without destroying the door entirely. He'd painted the walls yellow. He'd stenciled clouds near the ceiling, working at night after Diane was asleep, standing on a stepladder with a small brush and a patience that had nowhere else to go. September 23rd, 1997. Sophie saw the room for the first time today. She cried and held on to me and said, "Now he can't get me." She said it 3 times. Now he can't get me. I don't know if I've done something right or something terrible, but I know my daughter hasn't slept through the night in a year, and last night she did. Dale sat back from the journal. The kitchen was quiet around him. The fire in the living room had burned low. Through the ceiling, he could hear Caleb moving in his room, the small sounds of a teenager settling into sleep. He thought about a man building a room for his daughter at night while his wife thought he was losing his mind. He thought about the loneliness of being right about something and having no way to prove it. He thought about the yellow paint and the handmade clouds and what it cost a person to do the right thing in complete isolation. He picked up the journal and kept reading. The entry that changed everything was dated November 12th, 1999. Frank's handwriting here was less controlled than elsewhere, still legible, still deliberate, but with an underlying shakiness that hadn't been present in earlier entries. Glenn came by unexpectedly today. Diane was at work, just him and me in the house. I put Sophie in her room before I answered the door. She'd seen his car from the upstairs window and was already halfway there on her own. Glenn asked where she was. I said she was at a friend's house. He smiled. I've spent 4 years trying to articulate what is wrong with Glenn Wolcott's smile, and the closest I've gotten is this. It's the smile of someone who has already won an argument you didn't know you were having. He looked past me into the house. He said kids shouldn't hide from family. He said it wasn't healthy. The way he said it, the specific word he used, hide, made the hair on my arms stand up. He shouldn't have known she was hiding. I hadn't said anything about hiding. Dale set the journal down on the table. He sat very still. Then he picked it up again. November 15th, 1999. I've been thinking about what Sophie told me 2 weeks ago, something I wrote down at the time and haven't been able to stop turning over. She said Glenn knows things about her from before. She's said variations of this over the years, and I've always assumed she meant general things, that he'd heard about her background from Carol, from Diane, from family conversations. But 2 weeks ago, I asked her directly what she meant by before. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, before you and Mama, before the other families. He knew me when I was little, and I didn't like him then either. Before the other families. Glenn Wolcott married Carol in 1991. Sophie was adopted by us in 1993 through Millhaven County Family Services. I've been trying to understand how a man could have known my daughter before she came to us. There is one answer that fits. I've been sitting with it for 2 weeks and it doesn't get less true with time. Dale turned the page. I called Millhaven County Family Services today. I asked if they could tell me anything about the caseworkers assigned to Sophie's file prior to her placement with us. The woman I spoke to said she couldn't share that information. I asked if she could at least confirm whether a Glenn Wolcott had ever been employed by the agency. There was a pause. She said she wasn't able to discuss personnel matters. I thanked her and hung up. The pause was enough. Dale put the journal down and looked at the wall. Glenn Walcott had been a caseworker. He had worked for the adoption agency that placed Sophie with the Aldrins. He had access to Sophie's file, her history, her placements, her vulnerabilities, the shape of what she'd survived before she came to Millhaven. He had used that access not to protect her, but to find her. He had followed her into a family and worn the face of a concerned uncle for years, while Frank Aldrin built walls and locks and handmade clouds, and everyone around Frank told him he was losing his mind. The last entry in the journal was dated January 4th, 2000. We're leaving. The investigation cleared us technically. No charges, no formal findings of abuse. But the damage is done. Diane's sister won't speak to us. The town has opinions. Sophie hasn't spoken more than a dozen words since they brought her back. The house feels like something that happened to us rather than something we built. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know. Not for vindication. That ship has sailed. I just need there to be a record somewhere. Frank Aldrin was not a monster. Frank Aldrin saw something real and tried to protect his daughter from it with the only tools he had. And it wasn't enough, but it was everything. If you're reading this, if you found this journal in this house, please understand, the room wasn't madness. It was love. Take care of this place. It held us for a while. Maybe it can hold someone else. Dale sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he finished reading. The fire had gone completely cold. The house was quiet. Outside, through the plywood-covered windows, the wind moved through the November trees. He picked up his phone. It was past midnight. He sat with the phone in his hand and thought about Glenn Wolcott, who was Renee's brother and Caleb's uncle, and who had been asking careful questions about Caleb's routines and schedule and whereabouts for the better part of 2 years. He thought about the way Caleb had said he barely knows me and the way Dale's stomach had dropped when he heard it. He thought about a man in a suit with a yellow legal pad sitting in a courtroom and looking at Dale with measured, reasonable concern. He went back to the hidden room, alone this time while Caleb slept. He searched methodically under the bed, behind the shelves, inside the toy chest. At the bottom of the chest, beneath stuffed animals arranged with the care of someone who had loved them, his fingers found a seam in the wooden base, a false bottom, thin plywood, lifting out to reveal a shallow space below. Inside, wrapped in a plastic Ziploc bag, a VHS tape in a plastic case. The label, written in neat handwriting, Diane's record, December 1999. Dale held the tape in both hands. He drove to the Goodwill in Bloomington first thing Sunday morning and bought a VCR for $20 from a man who seemed genuinely relieved to be rid of it. Back at the house, he connected it to the small, portable television he'd bought at a yard sale in October, fed the tape in, and pressed play. The image resolved slowly through tracking lines and static. A woman appeared on screen. Early 30s, thin, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back. She was sitting on a couch in a living room. This living room, Dale realized, recognizing the brick fireplace behind her. The fireplace he'd been building fires in for 6 weeks. Diane Aldrin. She looked directly into the camera with the steady expression of someone who had decided to do something difficult and wasn't going to look away from it. "My name is Diane Aldrin," she said. "Today is December 15th, 1999. I'm recording this because what I'm about to say won't be believed, and I need there to be a record somewhere for someone." She paused, looked off to the side, nodded slightly at someone outside the frame. "Glenn Wolcott," she said, was employed as a caseworker at Millhaven County Family Services from 1991 through 1995. He handled adoption placements. He had direct access to the files of children awaiting placement, their histories, their previous homes, their vulnerabilities. She looked back into the camera. Sophie was one of those children. Dale sat on the floor in front of the small television, his back against the couch, his coffee going cold beside him, and listened to Diane Aldrin explain in a quiet, steady voice exactly what Frank had figured out and exactly what it had cost them both. Glenn had followed Sophie into their family. He had used his access to her file to identify her, a child with a difficult history, a child who couldn't clearly articulate what had happened to her before, a child whose fear might be dismissed as anxiety or instability or the expected behavior of a troubled kid. He had integrated himself into their lives through Carol, through family connection, through the simple fact of being present and helpful and trusted. When Frank built the hidden room barn, when Frank created the one place Glenn couldn't reach, Glenn had destroyed him for it. He reported us to Child Protective Services, Deanne said. He told them Frank was unstable, obsessive, hiding our daughter in a secret room. He brought the caseworker to our house personally. He stood on our lawn and watched them take Sophie away. She stopped, steadied herself. My husband was right about everything, and I didn't believe him until they took our daughter. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life. The tape ran for another few minutes. Diane named dates, named contacts at the agency, named the sequence of events as precisely as she could reconstruct them. Then she reached forward, and the image cut to static. Dale sat in the silence for a while. Then he opened his laptop and started searching. Frank Aldrin, obituary, 2018. The search returned a result from the Evansville Courier Press. Frank James Aldrin, 63, of Evansville, passed away Tuesday. He is survived by his daughter, Sophie Strandvik, of Portland, Oregon. Sophie Strandvik. She changed her name. Married name, probably, or a deliberate distance from what had happened. Either way, she'd maintained contact with Frank. She'd been there at the end. That meant something. The search for Sophie Strandvik in Portland took 20 minutes of careful looking through limited social media profiles and professional directories. When he found her, the profile picture showed a woman in her late 30s with brown hair and eyes that carried something old in them, something that had been through fire and come out the other side. Her profile listed her profession simply, trauma counselor, working with survivors of childhood abuse. Of course. Dale drafted an email carefully, 3 drafts before he got the language right. He explained who he was, he explained the house, what he'd found, why he was writing. He attached photographs of the hidden room, of Frank's journal, of the VHS tape label. He wrote simply and without drama because the facts were dramatic enough without help. He hit send before he could second guess it. He closed the laptop and went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Caleb's room. His son was asleep, one arm thrown over his face. The purple comforter from Sophie's room folded at the foot of Caleb's bed. Dale had moved it there when they had first set up his room, and neither of them had mentioned it since. Dale stood in the doorway and listened to his son breathe. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. An email notification. He'd sent his message 40 minutes ago. Mr. Mercer? Yes, I'm Sophie Aldrin. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to find that house. Call me. Now, if you can, a number. Portland area code. Dale walked downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, dialed. She answered on the first ring. Mr. Mercer? Her voice was warm and carried traces of something carefully managed. Old pain kept at a functional distance through years of deliberate work. Tell me everything, and then I need to tell you something that isn't in any of those journals. Dale told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a brief silence. Then Sophie Strandvik said, Glenn Wolcott picked your family the same way he picked mine. Through someone who trusted him completely. Through someone he'd spent years making dependent on his support. Another pause. Dale, he's not going to stop. He never stops. That's the thing people don't understand about men like him. They don't stop because they don't have to. Nobody ever makes them. Dale looked at the wall. Unless someone stops him somewhere, it actually counts, Sophie said. Her voice was very steady. Do you still have the tape? Yes. Good, she paused. Then we have somewhere to start. Sophie talked for an hour. Dale sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down everything she said, the way he used to write down the symptoms a customer described before he ever opened a hood. You listened first. You let the whole picture form before you started reaching for tools. The reaching too early was how men made expensive mistakes. Sophie had spent 20 years studying people like Glenn Wolcott. Not from a distance, not academically. She'd built her entire professional life around understanding the architecture of predatory behavior because understanding it was the only way she'd found to carry what had happened to her without being crushed by it. She knew how they moved through families. She knew how they built trust over years, how they identified the person whose trust would serve as a door, how they made that person dependent on them in ways that felt like love and support until the moment came to use the dependency as a lever. He doesn't leave evident, Sophie said. That's the first thing you need to understand. Men like Glenn are careful in ways that look like kindness. Every move he's made with your ex-wife, every time he encouraged her to fight you, every time he positioned himself as the concerned brother who just wanted what was best for Caleb, all of it looks like family. All of it looks like love. That's the design. Dale wrote that down. The room my father built, Sophie continued, and her voice shifted slightly when she said it, not breaking, just acknowledging weight. It's the only reason I survived intact enough to do what I do now. He gave me a space where I controlled the lock, where I decided when the door opened. That matters more than I can explain to someone who hasn't needed it. A pause. Don't destroy it, Dale. Whatever happens with the house, whatever happens next, don't destroy that room. I won't, Dale said. The tape and the journals won't be enough for criminal prosecution on their own. Too old, too indirect. My testimony too fragmented. But they might be enough for something more important right now. She let that sit for a moment. They might be enough to make Renee choose. After the call, Dale sat for a while in the dark kitchen. Then he went to bed and actually slept. Not well, not deeply, but the sleep of a man who has stopped waiting for something and started moving toward it. He called Renee on a Wednesday morning from the parking lot of Harmon's Auto, sitting in his truck with the engine running for heat, watching the sky go from gray to pale gray to the thin, flat white of a November morning that had decided against committing to anything. She answered on the third ring. I need to meet with you, Dale said. In person, without lawyers and without Glenn. A silence. Why would I agree to that? Because we were married for 9 years, and you know me well enough to know when something is genuinely serious. He kept his voice level, unhurried. And because what I need to tell you is about Caleb's safety in a way you haven't considered yet. Another silence. Longer. He could hear her breathing, the small sounds of a life going on around her. A door, a television somewhere. The particular quality of a house that had one person in it. If this is about Glenn, it is about Glenn, Dale said, and you need to hear it before anyone else tells you how to feel about it. She agreed to meet Thursday evening. A coffee shop in Bloomington on the west side, public enough that neither of them could make a scene, far enough from her neighborhood that she wouldn't run into anyone she knew. She picked the place. Dale said fine. He spent Wednesday night organizing his materials, Frank's journal excerpts, the photographs of Sophie's hidden room, the transcript he'd typed out from Diane's tape, Sophie's written statement that had arrived by email Tuesday morning, 9 pages long, written with the precision of a woman who had spent 2 decades finding words for things that resisted language. He read Sophie's statement twice before he put it in the folder. It was the most carefully constructed piece of writing he'd ever held. She didn't claim memories she didn't have. She didn't overstate. She documented what she knew, what she'd experienced, what she'd spent 20 years studying in other survivors that allowed her to understand her own history in retrospect. She named Glenn Wolcott twice by name, once in the context of her adoption case, once in the context of what her father had documented. She was precise about what was evidence and what was interpretation. She wrote like someone who had been disbelieved before and had decided that the best defense against disbelief was clarity. At the end, she had written one paragraph that Dale read 3 times. I am a trauma counselor with 20 years of clinical experience working with survivors of childhood predatory abuse. In my professional opinion, the behavioral pattern documented in my father's journals, in my own journals, and in my mother's recorded statement represents a textbook example of the grooming and access strategies used by predatory individuals who target children through family systems. The man described in these documents had access, opportunity, and demonstrated sustained interest in maintaining proximity to a vulnerable child over multiple years. I cannot speak to criminal liability. I can speak to pattern, and the pattern is unmistakable. Dale put the folder under his arm and drove to Bloomington. Renee was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with a coffee she wasn't drinking, dressed in the kind of careful, professional way she always dressed when she was bracing for something. She'd lost weight since the divorce. Stress had a way of doing that, and the custody case had been hard on both of them in different ways. She looked at Dale when he walked in with an expression that was guarded and tired, and something else underneath that he couldn't quite name. He sat down, didn't order anything. Before I show you anything, Dale said, I want to tell you a story about a man named Frank Aldrin. Renee's expression said she'd been expecting tactics and was recalibrating. All right. Mo, Dale told her Frank's story without the journals, without the evidence, just the narrative. A father in rural Indiana who adopted a little girl who was afraid of a specific person, who tried to tell the people around him and wasn't believed, who built a secret room because it was the only protection he could create with his own hands, who was destroyed by the system when the person he was protecting his daughter from used that system against him. He told it plainly. He didn't editorialize. He let Frank's choices speak for themselves. When he finished, Renee was quiet for a moment. That's a sad story, she said carefully, but I don't see what it has to do with. When did Glenn first suggest you fight for full custody? The question landed differently than an argument would have. He watched her face process it, not defensive, just surprised, remembering. He was being supportive. I was going through a difficult. I know you were. When did he first bring it up? Before you decided or after? Another silence. Longer. Before, she said finally, quietly. Has Glenn ever asked to take Caleb somewhere alone? Just the two of them? No other adults? He watched something move across her face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition of something she'd filed away in a drawer she hadn't opened. He asked about taking Caleb to a White Sox game last summer. Down in Chicago, just the two of them. Did you say yes? No. Her voice was slightly smaller now. I said Caleb had plans. Why did you really say no, Renee? She looked at her coffee cup. A long time passed. Outside the coffee shop window, the November street went about its business. Headlights, a couple walking a dory, someone's umbrella turning inside out in the wind. Something felt off about the way he asked, she said finally, the way he kept coming back to it, being just the two of them. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Well, she looked up. Glenn has always been good to me. After the divorce, he was the one who suggested the divorce. He was supportive of my decision. Renee, Dale kept his voice gentle. When did you decide to leave the marriage, and when did Glenn start telling you that you deserve better? The questions sat between them like an object placed on a table. Dale opened the folder and put Sophie's statement in front of her. Then Frank's journal excerpts. Then the typed transcript of Diane's recorded statement. He stacked them in that order deliberately. Sophie's professional assessment first, then the father's documentation, then the mother's recorded account. The architecture of evidence built from the inside out. Take your time, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Renee read. He watched her face while she read. Not because he was looking for a reaction to use, because he needed to know if she was capable of seeing it. He'd spent 9 years married to this woman. He knew how she processed difficult things. He knew the way her jaw set when she was fighting something and the different way it set when she was accepting something. He needed to know which one this was going to be. She read Sophie's statement twice. She read Frank's journal entries with her head bowed over the pages, one finger moving slowly along the lines. When she got to Diane's transcript, her hands were not entirely steady. She finished, set the papers down, looked at the table. The adoption agency, she said, Millhaven County Family Services. He worked there from 1991 to 1995. He would have had her file. Yes, he would have known everything about her before she ever came to that family. Yes, Renee sat very still. Dale had seen her angry before, frightened before, exhausted and devastated and relieved. He had never seen her look the way she looked right now, as if the ground beneath the building she'd lived in for years had just been shown to be hollow, as if the foundation of something had turned out to be a painted surface over nothing. He pushed me toward the custody fight, she said, quietly as if working it out in real time. He said you were unstable. He said Caleb needed stability. He said. She stopped. He had a list. He always had a list of reasons. I thought he was being a good brother. I thought he understood what I was going through. He understood what you had, Dale said. He understood that your trust in him was a door. Renee's eyes filled. She didn't let it go further than that. She pressed it back with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had gotten very good at managing her own responses. But he saw it. If you're wrong about this, she said, if this is, Renee, look at me. She looked at him. You've known me for 15 years. You know I don't play games with Caleb's safety. You know I'm not creative enough to construct something like this. He held her gaze. And you knew something was wrong with that baseball game offer before I ever showed you a piece of paper. You knew it, and you acted on it, and then you talked yourself out of knowing it because the alternative was too hard. A long silence. He's my brother, she said. The words carried the weight of something said because it needed to be said, not because it changed anything. Frank Aldrin's wife said something like that, Dale said quietly. She said Glenn was her family. She didn't believe her husband, and she spent the rest of her life carrying that. Renee picked up her phone. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she called her lawyer and told him to withdraw the custody motion. The lawyer argued. Dale could hear the tinny sound of pushback through the phone from across the table. Renee said with a clarity and finality that Dale recognized from the best version of the woman he'd married. I was wrong about the case and about the circumstances. Withdraw it. She hung up. She sat across from Dale in the corner of the coffee shop with the evidence of something terrible laid out on the table between them. And neither of them said anything for a while. What do I do about Carol? Renee said finally. My sister. She's married to him. She has no idea. You tell her. Not tonight, but you tell her. Dale gathered the papers back into the folder. She has to make her own choice about what to do with it, but she deserves to know. Renee nodded slowly, then she said, Can I see it? The room he built. The room Frank built for her. Dale looked at her. When? Now, tonight. She held his gaze. I need to understand what Glenn was willing to destroy. They drove to Millhaven in separate cars, Renee's headlights following Dale's truck down the winding two-lane through the dark woods of Brown County. Caleb was home. He looked up from the kitchen table when his mother walked through the door behind his father, and the expression on his face went through several things quickly before settling into something careful and watchful. Mom. Hi, baby. Renee crossed to him, huggled him in a way that was slightly longer and more deliberate than usual. The kind of hug that is also an apology and a reckoning. Caleb accepted it with the careful grace of a teenager who understands more than he's been told. Dale led them both upstairs, through the back bedroom with its floral wallpaper strips. To the wall that looked like a wall, he pressed the hidden peg. The door swung open. Door swung. Renee stepped into Sophie's room and her breath caught in the way that breathing catches when something unexpected has genuine weight. She stood in the center of the small space and turned slowly, taking in the yellow walls and the painted clouds and the 100 carefully taped drawings, the progression of a child's inner world from safety to fear to the dark hand reaching out of darkness. She walked to the wall and stood in front of the November 1998 drawing for a long time. Then she picked up the music box from the nightstand, the one engraved for Sophie, Love Always, Grandma Jean, and wound the key. The mechanism turned. A small, clear melody filled the room, delicate and slightly melancholy, the kind of tune that carries childhood in it the way certain smells do. Renee stood holding the music box with her eyes closed while the song played through once and stopped. She set it back down exactly where it had been. A father built this, she said. Her voice was steady but low, with his own hands, at night, because he had no other way to keep her safe. She turned to look at Dale, and Glenn used it to take her away from him. Yes, Renee looked at Caleb. Has Uncle Glenn ever made you feel unsafe, uncomfortable, anything specific? Caleb leaned in the doorway. He'd known the question was coming. Dale could see that he'd been preparing for it since they'd come upstairs. Not unsafe exactly, just he took a moment with the words. He watches me, like he's measuring something, and he asks questions that feel too personal. Where I go, who I'm with, what my routine is. A pause. He offered to take me to a game in Chicago last summer. Just us. I told Mom I had plans. He looked at Renee. I didn't have plans. Renee held her son's gaze. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? The question was not an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry, asked without heat, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. Renee looked at her son for a long moment. No, she said honestly, I don't think I would have, and I'm sorry for that. Caleb nodded. Something shifted in his face, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of the conditions under which forgiveness might eventually become possible. Glenn Wolcott filed his independent petition 4 days later. Margaret Dunbar called Dale on a Monday morning while he was under a Buick with a brake line problem that required his full attention but wasn't getting it. She was direct in the way people are direct when they've stopped worrying about softening things. He's filing as a concerned family member. Indiana statute allows third-party welfare petitions in active custody situations. He's claiming Renee came to him with concerns about the property, about your living situation, and that as her brother and Caleb's uncle, he has standing to request a formal investigation. A pause. He's representing himself. Is that unusual? For something like this? Yes, it usually means one of two things. Either the person genuinely believes they don't need help, or they've done something like this before and they know exactly how far they can push without it becoming something else. Dale thought about what Sophie had said. He never stops. Nobody ever makes him. What do we have? Dale asked. We have Frank Aldrin's journals, which are compelling but not direct testimony. We have the VHS recording, which is powerful but 25 years old and unverifiable in terms of chain of custody. We have Sophie Strandvik's written statement, which is the strongest piece because she's a credentialed professional making specific claims. But she's in Portland. She's not testifying in person. And Glenn will argue it's hearsay from someone with an obvious personal grievance. Dunbar's voice was careful and precise. And we have Renee, who is willing to testify. What does that get us? It gets us a mother contradicting the person who brought the petition. It gets us a pattern argument. It gets us Caleb's own testimony about his discomfort. A pause. It doesn't get us a criminal conviction, Dale. That's not what this hearing is. What this hearing is a judge deciding whether Glenn Wolcott gets ongoing access to your son. Then that's what matters. Yes, Dunbar said, that's what matters. The hearing was on a Monday morning in November in a courtroom that was smaller than Dale had expected. Judge Barbara Weston, a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years watching people tell her partial truths and had developed considerable skill at identifying the missing parts. Glenn was already there when Dale arrived. Sitting at his table in an expensive charcoal suit, legal pad in front of him, looking like exactly what he'd always looked like. A successful, reasonable, genuinely concerned man who happened to be present in a room because he cared about a child's welfare. He greeted the bailiff by name. He smiled at the clerk. He was very good at rooms like this. Dale sat down at his own table beside Margaret Dunbar and didn't look at Glenn again. The opening was straightforward. Glenn presented his case calmly and methodically. The photographs of 1847 Ridgewood Lane, as it had appeared in October, the documented history of a CPS removal from the property in 1999, the fact that the hidden room still existed and had been maintained by the current occupant. He presented it as a pattern of poor judgment, as evidence of instability, as the considered concern of a family member who had watched Dale Mercer make reckless decision after reckless decision while a 16-year-old boy bore the consequences. He was good. Dale gave him that. He stayed on the facts he could support and let the implications build themselves. Judge Weston listened without expression. Then Margaret Dunbar stood up. She presented the renovation photographs first, the before and after of 1847 Ridgewood Lane, 6 weeks apart, the transformation from condemned structure to functioning home. She presented Dale's employment records, 17 years without significant interruption, consistent income, consistent presence. She presented the school reports, Caleb's grades stable, his attendance regular, his teachers reporting a student who was engaged and developing well. Then she put Frank Aldrin's journals in front of the judge. Glenn's first objection came quickly. Your Honor, this is dated material from a family that was investigated by Child Protective Services. The man who wrote these journals had his daughter removed from the home because of his behavior. Using his documentation as evidence of anything other than poor judgment seems. Mr. Wolcott, Judge Weston said, you'll have your opportunity to respond. Continue, Ms. Dunbar. Dunbar walked Judge Weston through the timeline, Frank's documentation of Sophie's fear, the construction of the hidden room, the CPS report and removal, the family's departure, the 20-year vacancy, Dale's purchase and the discovery of the journals, the tape, the drawings. Then she put Sophie Strandvik's statement on the record. Glenn's objection was smooth and immediate. Your Honor, this is a written statement from a woman with a clear personal grievance, submitted remotely without cross-examination. She describes feelings and impressions from childhood, filtered through decades of, she herself acknowledges, fragmented memory. It carries no evidentiary weight that should. Mr. Wolcott, Judge Weston's voice was patient and final. The statement is on the record. I'll determine what weight it carries. She read it. The courtroom was quiet while she read. Dale watched her face and saw nothing he could interpret. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at Glenn. Mr. Wolcott, you were employed as a caseworker at Millhaven County Family Services from 1991 to 1995. It wasn't a question. Glenn recognized that it wasn't a question. That's correct, Your Honor. I worked in child welfare services before transitioning to accounting. It was a different period of my. During that period, did you have access to the adoption file of a child named Sophie Aldrin, placed through that agency in 1993? A pause. Brief, a fraction of a second, but Dale had been watching for it. In the course of my duties, I would have had access to many files. I can't specifically. Did you have a professional relationship with the Aldrin family prior to becoming related to them through marriage? Another pause. Glenn's expression remained composed, but something had shifted in it. A small, almost invisible tightening around the eyes. Your Honor, I think what's happening here is that Mr. Mercer has constructed a very compelling narrative using old, unverified documents. And this court is being asked to. Mr. Wolcott, please answer the question. In the second row of seats, Renee stood up. Your Honor, may I address the court? Glenn turned. The composed expression held for a moment longer than was natural. Renee, you don't need to do this. This isn't. I know I don't. Her voice was clear and steady in the quiet room. That's exactly why I'm choosing to. Judge Weston looked at Renee. You're Caleb Mercer's mother? Yes, Your Honor. I'm the person who brought my concerns to Glenn in the first place. I'm the person whose trust he used to bring this petition. She paused. I'd like to correct the record. Come forward. Renee walked to the front of the courtroom and stood in the space between the tables. She didn't look at Glenn again. She looked at the judge. I withdrew my own custody motion 10 days ago because I realized I had been wrong. Wrong about my ex-husband and wrong about my brother. She spoke carefully, not reading from notes, just speaking. For 2 years, Glenn encouraged me to fight Dale for full custody. He told me Dale was unstable, that Caleb needed stability, that I was doing the right thing for my son. I believed him because he was my brother and I trusted him, and I was going through something difficult and his support felt like love. She stopped for a moment, steadied herself. Last summer, Glenn asked to take Caleb to a baseball game in Chicago. Just the two of them, no other adults. He asked 3 times. He was specific about it being just the two of them. Her voice remained level. Something felt wrong about the way he asked. I said no without fully letting myself understand why I said no. I told myself I was being overprotective. She looked at the judge. I was not being overprotective. I was being a mother who was reading something correctly and didn't have language for it yet. Judge Weston was writing. Does your son share your assessment of his interactions with Mr. Wolcott? Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to hear from Caleb. But Caleb walked to the front of the courtroom the way Dale had watched him walk through difficult things over the past 6 weeks, with the careful, deliberate composure of someone who had decided that composure was a form of protection. He stood in front of Judge Weston and looked at her directly. How are things at home, Caleb? With your father? Caleb considered the question seriously. Better than I expected them to be. We've fixed most of the house together. I have a real room. It's quiet out there. A pause. I feel like I know my dad better now than I did when we lived in Bloomington. We had to actually talk to each other out there. There wasn't anywhere else to go. And your uncle? Glenn Wolcott? Caleb's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He makes me uncomfortable, he said. Not because of anything he's done that I could point to exactly. It's the way he pays attention. Too much, too focused. He asks where I go, who I'm with, what my schedule is. He asks in a way that feels like he's collecting information. He paused. When he offered to take me to Chicago, I didn't want to go. I didn't want to be alone with him. He looked at the judge steadily. I didn't have a reason I could explain. I just knew. Did you tell anyone about this feeling? No, because Glenn had everyone convinced he was just being a good uncle. And I was afraid. He stopped. Tried again. I was afraid if I said something, I'd just be another problem. Judge Weston looked at him for a long moment. You're not a problem, Caleb. Thank you for telling me. She made notes. The courtroom was very quiet. When she looked up, she looked at Glenn. He was sitting very still. The legal pad in front of him was untouched. The composed expression was still in place, but it had cost him something to maintain it. Dale could see that now, could see the effort underneath the surface in the same way he could hear the effort in an engine that was working too hard to sound normal. Mr. Wolcott, Judge Weston said, I'm going to vote on this petition now. Glenn straightened slightly. This petition is dismissed. Her voice was even and unhurried. Mr. Mercer has clearly provided a stable, caring home environment for his son. The property concerns raised by Mr. Wolcott do not reflect current conditions, and the historical concerns about the property have been thoroughly contextualized. She set her pen down. However, she looked at Glenn directly. What I have heard today concerns me significantly. I have a written professional assessment from a credentialed trauma counselor describing a behavioral pattern. I have testimony from that counselor's own experience with this individual. I have testimony from the child's mother describing specific incidents that align with that pattern. And I have testimony from the child himself describing sustained discomfort with this individual's behavior. She paused. I don't have enough before me today to do more than what I'm doing. But I am doing it. She picked up her pen and wrote something. I am ordering that Glenn Wolcott have no contact with the minor Caleb Mercer, supervised or otherwise, pending referral of this matter to the county prosecutor's office for independent review. She looked up. Mr. Wolcott, I want to be direct with you. This court's only concern in this room is the safety of a child. I am not making a finding of criminal conduct. I am making a finding that the safety of this child requires your absence from his life, while other authorities make their own determinations. A pause. Consider yourself fortunate, that's all I'm doing today. She stood. Everyone stood. This hearing is concluded. Mr. Mercer, continue being the father your son clearly needs. She left the bench. Outside the courthouse, the November air was cold and direct. The kind of cold that comes in off flat Midwestern land without anything to slow it down. Dale stood on the steps with Caleb beside him and Renee a few feet away, all three of them processing the last 2 hours in the silence that follows something that has taken a long time to arrive. Glenn had left through a side exit without speaking to any of them. Is it over? Caleb asked. The legal part of it, Dale said. The investigation they're opening, that takes time. That might not go anywhere. Men like Glenn are careful. They're hard to prosecute. He looked at his son. But he can't get to you now. That's what matters today. Renee came to stand beside them. She looked at Dale with an expression he hadn't seen from her in years. Direct and tired and without the protective architecture of the custody war between them. I'm sorry, she said, for the 2 years, for not seeing it sooner. For letting him. She stopped. For everything. Dale looked at her. The apology was real. He could hear that it was real. You saw it when it counted, he said. That's what Frank Aldrin's wife couldn't do until it was too late. Renee nodded. Her eyes were bright, but she held it together. She turned to Caleb and looked at her son for a moment. Can I come see what you two have built out there, the house? Caleb looked at his father, then back at his mother. Yeah, he said. There's still a lot left to do. The county prosecutor's office opened a formal investigation in December. By February, Glenn Wolcott's accounting license had been suspended pending the investigation's outcome. The firm where he'd worked for 11 years asked him to take indefinite leave. Carol filed for divorce in January, 3 weeks after Renee drove to her house and sat with her for 4 hours and told her everything. Carol had not spoken to Renee since. That silence was the kind that comes from a person who has been shown something they cannot yet afford to believe. But 3 months later, Renee received a single text from her sister. No explanation, no apology, just, I know. Renee had sat with her phone for a long time after that. Some truths take time. Some people arrive at them on their own terms, or not at all. Either way, the silence between the sisters had shifted into something with a different quality. The silence of a person deciding rather than a person refusing. The investigation turned up two additional cases. Women in their 30s in other parts of Indiana who had passed through the foster system in the early 1990s, who had filed complaints that had been dismissed or mishandled, whose fragmented memories had been deemed insufficient. The prosecutor was building something. Whether it would be enough was not yet known, but the building itself meant something. Glenn Walcott lived diminished in a rented apartment in Indianapolis, his respectability dissolved, his access gone, his careful architecture of trust and proximity dismantled by the testimony of people he had believed would never be believed. Sophie Strandvik came in April. She drove a rental car down Ridgewood Lane on a Saturday morning when the trees were just beginning to come back, the first green pushing through the gray. Dale heard the car on the gravel and went to the porch. Caleb came out behind him. She stepped out of the car and stood for a moment looking at the house. It was white again. Not perfect, not pristine, but honest, the fresh paint covering the weathered clapboard that had been exposed for 30 years. The porch was straight. The windows caught the morning light. The flower boxes were empty still, but Dale had been thinking about what to put in them. Sophie looked at the house the way a person looks at something they once knew in a different form, trying to map the memory onto the present. Her eyes moved slowly across the facade, taking inventory. Then she looked at Dale and Caleb, and she smiled, genuinely with the quality of a smile that has earned its right to exist. "It looks like someone lives here," she said. They gave her coffee and time and the quiet of the house around them. She walked through the room slowly, running her hand along the refinished wood of the staircase banister, pausing at the kitchen with its working stove and cabinets Dale had stripped and repainted. She stood at the fireplace where Diane had sat on a winter day in 1999 and looked directly into a camera and tried to leave a record for whoever might need it. Sophie stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the mantel, looking at the brick the way you look at something that has witnessed more than it can say. When they went upstairs, Sophie walked to the bedroom without being guided. She knew the way. She stood at the wall, and Dale pressed the hidden peg, and the door swung open. Sophie stood at the threshold for a long moment. Then she walked in. Dale and Caleb waited in the doorway. They watched Sophie move through the room she had last been in as a 12-year-old girl, being taken out of it by force. She didn't catalog it the way Dale had the first time. She wasn't discovering it. She was remembering it, her hand trailing along the yellow wall, her eyes finding the clouds her father had painted at midnight and staying there for a long time, taking in the careful brushwork of a man who'd stood on a stepladder, trying to bring sky into a windowless space. When she reached the last drawing, the dark hand in November 1998, she stood very still and reached up and touched the edge of it lightly with two fingers, the way you touch something that has been waiting for you. "I don't remember drawing this," she said. "I don't remember most of what happened in here. My therapist says that's common. The mind protects itself by burying what it can't process." She lowered her hand. "But I remember feeling safe. I remember that my father built this for me and that when I was in here, I could breathe." She turned to look at Dale. He couldn't stop what was happening. He couldn't make anyone believe him. But he could give me this one place, and he did. Dale picked up the music box from the nightstand. He held it out to her. "This should be with you. It was always yours." Sophie looked at the engraving on the bottom. "For Sophie, love always, Grandma Jean." She took it from him carefully, cradling it the way you hold something that contains years inside it. She wound the key. The small mechanism released its melody into the quiet room. The same tune that had played in this space 100 times for a frightened child who needed sound and softness, and the knowledge that someone had put her name on something and meant it. The song played through once, stopped. Sophie held the music box against her chest. "Thank you," she said, "for finding this, for not letting it stay buried." She spent an hour in the room. Dale and Caleb gave her privacy and went downstairs and made lunch. When she came down, her eyes were clear and her hands were steady, and she was carrying herself the way someone carries themselves after they have put something down that they've been holding for a very long time. Before she left, she took a folded piece of paper from her bag and went back upstairs. Dale heard her footsteps in the bedroom, the soft click of the hidden door opening. A silence, the click of it closing again. When she came back down, the paper was gone. For whoever needs it next, she said simply, so the story doesn't get lost again. She hugged Caleb first, holding on a beat longer than necessary. Then Dale. Her grip was firm and brief and said what it needed to say without language. She walked to her car, turned back once. Take care of this house, Dale. It knows what it's doing. She drove down the lane and the trees closed behind her. That evening, after the last of the daylight had gone from the sky and the woods around the property had settled into their nighttime rhythms, Dale and Caleb sat in the rocking chairs on the porch. The chairs were new. Dale had built them in February from lumber he'd milled from a fallen oak at the back of the property, the work of 3 weekends and a satisfaction that had nothing to do with money. The night was cool, but not cold. Spring was committing to itself finally. The woods around the clearing were fully alive again, leaves moving in a light wind that smelled like wet earth and new growth. Inside the house behind them, in rooms that had been rebuilt by 2 sets of hands over a winter that had been hard and good in equal measure, the lights were on. The fireplace that had warmed nothing for 20 years was burning low. The kitchen where Diane Aldrin had sat in 1999 with a camera in a last attempt at truth was clean and functional and smelled like the dinner they'd made together. Upstairs, behind a wall that still looked like a wall to anyone who didn't know where to press, Sophie's room waited in the darkness, her drawings still on the walls, her music box gone, but the shelf where it had sat still holding its shape. A letter from a woman in Portland folded in place where someone might find it someday when they needed it. Caleb rocked slowly in his chair, looking out at the dark line of the trees. He was quiet for a while in the way he'd learned to be quiet out here, not the closed, defended quiet of the apartment in Bloomington, but something more open, the quiet of a person who has enough space to actually think. Dad, he said finally. Yeah. I'm glad you spent that $500. Dale looked at the house, at the white paint and the straight porch and the windows that held light now instead of showing darkness. He thought about a Tuesday night in late September, a kitchen counter, a notebook, $517, and a phone call that had demanded the last of it. He thought about what it meant to choose between the thing that looked like safety and the thing that felt like right when those two things pointed in opposite directions. He thought about Frank Aldrin standing in this same house at midnight with a paintbrush and a stepladder, making clouds for a child who needed sky. A man who had done everything right and lost everything anyway and still found it worth doing. A man whose room had protected a girl Dale had never met and then, 25 years later, had protected his son. Some things outlast their makers. Some love echoes forward through decades in empty rooms and sealed walls until it finds the person who needs it. Some houses are just wood and plaster and the accumulated weight of weather. And some houses choose their occupants with a precision that doesn't have a rational explanation and doesn't need one. Me too, son, Dale said. Me too. The porch held them. The house stood behind them, solid and scarred and restored, doing exactly what it had always been built to do. Not just sheltering them from the cold, but holding something in its walls that mattered. The record of a father who hadn't given up. The evidence that love could outlast the worst that people did to it. The proof that some rooms, once built for protection, never really stopped protecting. And upstairs in the dark, behind a wall that looked like a wall, a story waited in the yellow light, in the painted clouds, in the 100 careful drawings of a child who had needed sky, waited for whoever might need it next, the way all true things wait, patient and permanent, for the moment they become necessary again.